Hello, Shalom, this is Rabbi Sachs. Welcome to the Chai Academy, coming to you from the Chai Center. The Chai Academy is a plethora of classes or courses on topics of Jewish interest. It could be Jewish law, it could be Jewish history, it could be holidays, so many different variables. So we have, for the past couple of weeks, been talking about modern day Israel, some history, and some miracles that occurred. And so we've been doing this from pre Declaration of Independence, and we're chugging along in time. We're going to talk today about something that's controversial in the history of Israel. It's not pleasant, to say the least, to talk about the goings on, etc., of what occurred. It's the truth is somewhere in the middle. However, this would be a blight, a stain on Israel's stellar character. I believe that Israel is an extremely moral country with an extremely moral army, and but they had their beginning birth pangs were their beginnings. There were some errors, according to some. So we know Israel has an external problem. We know that Arabs and Jews are in that region do not get along for the most part, especially if they live in the Palestinian areas. The Israeli Arabs they do get along. You have the occasional attack, but violence you can have in Times Square as well. So the Israeli Arabs who live in Israel, generally speaking, peaceful, and not really an issue. But that's the external problems. Anybody that's not Jewish, I'm going to call external as far as Israel is concerned. Now, Israel has an internal problem, or had an internal problem. It has been settled for the most part. The internal problem is the great divide between the Sephardim and Ashkenazim. Ashkenaz means German, Sephardim means Spain, but that's very, very narrow. The Sephardim and Ashkenazim, Sephardim would be any Jews living in Arab countries. Ashkenazim would be any Jews coming from Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe. That would be considered Ashkenazim. And they've had very, very different upbringings, and they have very different customs. And therefore in Israel, they have two chief rabbis. You have an Ashkenaz, a chief rabbi, and then you have a Sephard chief rabbi, because it's very different. Their makeup is different. The way they see things, Jewish law is different. And their culture is also, says a lot. Basically, in the world, let's take the United States. So there are 80% Ashkenazim and 20% Sephardim. In Israel at this stage, it's 50-50. It's 50-50, but it wasn't always 50-50. It was 80-20 as well. So, in 1948, the country was made up of Ashkenazi Jews who came from Europe. Think of David Ben-Gurion, Yitzhak Shamir, think of Menachem Begin, you think of all the people under them. They're all European Jews. They were Ashkenazim. And but Israel is for all Jews, and we had a whole separate class on the law of return. Israel is for all Jews, so they accepted Jews from all cultures, backgrounds, countries. And it created a rift. when Sephardim started to come. So the Sephardim were viewed by the Ashkenazim as somewhat primitive. And in fact, if you get hold of a paper from the early 50s, it really mocks Sephardim. Call them the primitive ones are entering. So the Ashkenazim viewed themselves as the elite, and the Ashkenazim as the dirty, unwashed. That's how it was viewed, and that's how it was viewed, by the way, for quite some time. It's not like that anymore, but it was, and because it's extremely painful. Basically, those that came from the Arab lands, we're talking about, 1948, I think everybody was poor, right? But those that came in the 50s and the 60s, they had a lower level of secular education. Religious education was probably more, but secular education, and they were manual labor. That's what they did. They were manual labor, as opposed to being technicians and tank drivers and airline pilots and fighter pilots, etc. They were more manual. Israel was an extremely poor country when it first started. If you would only know what they fought with in the War of Independence, it's just miraculous in itself. But it was an extremely poor country. And so because it was poor, it was difficult to help the Sephardim who were poor and only knew manual labor. And for the most part, the Sephardim were put in what they called transit camps. The transit camps were tent cities. It was a bunch of tent cities, and this is where they lived until it took a long time before they were fully acclimated and brought into Israel proper. But can you imagine huge tent cities? Israel could only afford tents. They couldn't afford to make any type of low-income housing. So a member of Knesset, David Levy, he said that when my parents came from Morocco, my father was a craftsman, and he could create a beautiful carpentry. He was a mill worker, a woodworker, a craftsman, very talented at that. But coming from Morocco, because we discussed this as well, that a lot of the Jews were expelled from their countries or they made it untenable to live once Israel declared independence. So coming from Morocco, they felt they had to flee. And he says he lost his tools. And when he came to Israel, he said, if you give me tools, I can be productive. But they didn't have money for tools. So David Levy writes that he saw, is it Levy maybe? He saw his father basically go from a provider, go from a head of household to a depressed person who could not make money for his family and essentially lived in refugee camps. So when you talk about refugee camps, you talk about them, the Arabs are refugees. There were 700,000 Arabs or refugees. There were 1 million Jews or refugees kicked out from Arab lands, and they had no money. So they lived in tent cities. So David Levy said that what my father lived through, he was crushed. He went from greatness to being incredibly talented craftsman to a nothing, to every ounce of joy sucked out of his life. Slowly, over the course of time, the Sephardim began to acclimate. And today, a third of university is made up of Sephardim. So you can no longer call them uneducated any longer because they occupy, there's a lot, there's a third of Sephardim go to universities. In 1983, the army appointed for the very first time a Sephardi chief rabbi. So they always had chief rabbis in the army to make sure that, in the it's interesting, in the Israeli army they only serve kosher. Right, in the Israeli army they accommodate religious traditions and beliefs, etc. Naturally, so the first chief rabbi who was a Sephardi was in 1983. But the Sephardim for the first 20 years, or even 30 years, 25 years, were treated poorly. And we'll talk about it in greater detail, but when they came into to Israel from all these Arab countries, they were sprayed with disinfectant because Israel didn't want diseases come in, so they just sprayed and hosed them down. Now I will tell you, I once flew to South Africa not long ago, and we stopped off in Dakar, and we didn't get out of the plane, we stayed in the plane. And then we were about to take off from Dakar to Johannesburg, and we were sprayed with disinfectant. They came in with this fogger, and we were sitting in our seats, and we were fogged. And it was belittling. I guess they in Johannesburg didn't want to bring in diseases. Who knows what was coming in from Dakar? And they sprayed us, and it was. As a journalist, Zev Chafetz, he's a very famous journalist. So he writes that many times he was told by Israelis who were Ashkenazim. We're talking about in the younger years. They said, "My grandparents founded Israel. They founded Israel, and they brought it from this desert, the swamps, into a beautiful place. And the Sephardim have ruined it. They've brought it down to a dirty place, and I hate their culture. I hate what they stand for." So there was a big divide, and it was terrible. Now the Sephardim haven't forgotten it. They haven't forgotten how poorly they were treated. Nowadays, by the way, in Israel, you're an Israeli. You're less of a Sephardi or Ashkenazi. You are an Israeli, right? So it's almost like the United States. If you live where I live, in the public schools, right? While racism does exist, of course, and it's a blight on the United States, but most of these kids, right? White kids have black friends. Black kids have white friends, and likewise other cultures. It's less and less. Why? Because you live in Suffolk County. You're an American. You're a Long Islander. So it's less and less. Do you have idiots and yahoos and blowhards? Of course. Does racism exist? Of course. But thankfully so. It's much less and less. Now, many reasons why the Ashkenazim hated the Sephardim is because the Sephardim tended to be more hawkish as opposed to the Ashkenazim. So Begin won in 1977 and became prime minister in 1978 due to the religious parties and the Sephardim. They voted in Begin. So they said, "Oh yeah, these are the and it was like the Likud party." Now it's not like that, but it was. The Likud party was considered by the Labour Party, almost like how the Democrats view the Republicans and the Republicans view the Democrats. A distaste, which is sad. But now the Sephardim, right? Another reason is they could not sympathize with the Ashkenazim, what they went through Germans. In other words, when Israel was started in 1948, post-Holocaust, and these Sephardim came in, and they were told about the Germans, the Sephardim used to say, the Arabs. Their enemy, they hated Arabs more than Germans. and the Israelis hated Germans more. The Ashkenazim hated the Germans more than the Arabs. So they didn't even speak a common language over who they hated. So as I said, it was a cultural thing. The Sephardim were tortured, tormented by these Arab countries. We're talking about Egypt, we're talking about Syria, we're talking about Lebanon, we're talking about Libya, Iran, Iraq, and Morocco, Yemen. They were tortured. And the Ashkenazim were tortured by the Germans, the Russians, the Bolsheviks, the Ukrainians, the Poles, the Lithuanians, and the Hungarians, etc. So it was a different hate. Now, the reason why I say it's somewhat controversial, because this till now basically was history. What we're going to talk about now is also history, but it will leave you with a sad taste. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention it. So they had something called the Ringworm scandal in Israel. So essentially, when Sephardim, and it was mostly Sephardim, when they came in from their countries, so their head was sprayed was radiated with radiation to get rid of ringworms, and it was mainly done to Sephardim. The problem is that it caused cancer. And so they were radiating to get rid of ringworm, which probably was a common way of getting ringworm back then. I mean, Hadassah Hospital was spraying this stuff, in the early 20th century. But they sprayed a lot of Sephardim, and a lot of Sephardim had brain cancer and different growths that came from that spraying. In fact, in 1994, the Knesset passed a compensation law that anybody that was sprayed from 1946, I believe it was in 1948, I'm not sure, to 1960, from the 40s to the 60s, if you were sprayed with this toxic, cancer-causing chemical, you had a right to receive compensation from the Israeli government. And so the Sephardim felt they felt totally humiliated, and also cancer. Who wants to live with this? Knowing that you have this. At any moment, you were radiated. You were irradiated with radiation. Imagine. We got all those kids out of Chernobyl, and because of here, they were bringing it to their heads, their scalps. That's one blight and one terrible thing. The other one is even worse. The other one is the Ashkenazim elite, Ben Gurion, people like that. So they've had 3 commissions on this, by the way, and all 3 commissions said they really found no evidence but there are life stories of people that it happened to. So when the Sephardim came, and for example, let's take Yemenite. They did this a lot with the Yemenite children. So it's called the Yemenite Children Affair. That's what it's actually called. So when these children came, or when these mothers gave birth in Israel, these new immigrants from Yemen, and they gave birth to a baby, they used to tell, this is the elites, completely, I can't believe these are my people. They used to tell the mothers that and sometimes it was true, that the baby had died, and the baby didn't make it. Which wasn't true. Sometimes it was true. They then used to take this baby and give it to an Ashkenazi family that could afford. It was not indigent family, and gave them the baby. and this was done hundreds and hundreds of times. The accusation is 4,500 times it was done. That is the accusation. So they had commissions after commissions after commissions, and they said, well, we see maybe with 50. So, but the commissions, was it done fairly or not? This is the controversy. But it was definitely done. And there's a very famous story of a woman named Ofra Mazor. So she was a Yemenite, right? And her mother told her, her mother's name was Yocheved. She said that, you had a sister, and your sister, they claim she died. I don't believe she died. I believe she was taken from us. And your sister, you had a sister. And anyway, the mother Yocheved died. And this was much later on. This is 30 to 35 years later. Ofra Mazor, who was very instrumental, and she was an activist with this whole Yemenite scandal, she submitted her DNA. Shortly thereafter, they found her biological sister, whose name was Varda Fuchs. Fuchs is a very Ashkenazi name. Mazor is a very, Sephardic name. So Varda Fuchs was taken from the Mazor family, and it was given to the Fuchs family to bring up in a nice Ashkenazi home. Now, if you Google pictures of Varda Fuchs, she don't look Ashkenazi. She doesn't. So really, it's criminal, and it was done other places in the world. It was done in Arab countries. It was done in African countries. They did it, and but they used to give it to Ashkenazi white families from the Sephardim, and so much so that there's an organization in Israel called Amram, AMRAM, that basically deal with this. They deal with this to try and reconnect and try and sue and try this, that, and the other, and expose the scandal. They're not the only one. There are others, but an organization was founded to talk about this Yemenite affair. The other reason about this Yemenite affair is that the early founders of Israel didn't necessarily look fondly towards religion. So if these kids weren't taken in schools, in public schools, they cut their payers off. They told them it's not necessary to wear a yarmulke. So they basically they didn't respect the Yemenite families, and it wasn't only Yemenites, but Yemenites is where the brouhaha. Think of the Yemenite Jews, what they went through, and then they came to Israel, and OMG, what they went through. They either claimed, and by the way, parents came to school to pick up their kids, and said, "I'm sorry, your kid was in a nasty accident and was in the hospital." So the parents went to the hospital. They said, "I'm sorry, your child died and was buried in Potter's Field, because we know you couldn't afford the burial." I mean, we're talking about horrific things. And so the child was, they trusted, they put their child in school, and the child never came home. I mean, this is Germanic, but that's what was done, and it was done because of money. It was done because they felt that the Sephardim could not rear their kids as good as Ashkenazim. It's really a blight. It's really a stain. Now, once again, Israel would say that it didn't happen often, and it was few and far between, not according to the Amram Foundation and other foundations at that. So there is bad feelings. There is bad feelings, and it's being fleshed out even as late as today. They're finding new stories, making new connections. Older kids, older people already. But it is a story, I believe, that has to be said. Now, having said that, my Sephardic brethren, you see it. You see the Jews that came to the United States from Iran or from Morocco. They band together. They're lively. They're not. Sometimes you find, and this is stereotyping, I know, you find Ashkenazi Jews who are kind of a little bit, they have a lot of defense mechanisms. They don't want to let themselves go. So on Simchat Torah, they won't, they won't let loose. Whereas Sephardim, just their culture, based on their parents, and they'll kiss the Torah 1,000 times. Where an Ashkenazi like me will kiss it once. It's a clear difference. It's interesting. It's a clear demarcation of culture, it is just, it's a different upbringing. It's a different, there's nature versus nurture. So this is a point for nurture, because it's a completely different upbringing. And now it's an interesting thing to me. I'm a fundraiser. I try to keep the Chai Center afloat, not well enough, but and sometimes especially in the earlier days, where I used to go to some Sephardic the Syrian community, whether in Deal or Ocean Parkway. I don't do it too much anymore. It's very hard for an Ashkenazi to break in, because they give to their Syrian charities, they give to their Sephardic brethren. For me to be able to fundraise, I had to get it was almost like an endorsement from one of their rabbis before they would make an appointment to see me. I sort of gave that up quickly and forged my own friendships and get supported by, the Suttons and the Settons, Syrian families, but not through going to the rabbis in Ocean Parkway or in Deal. So that is that is the scoop. It is, I'm sorry if you've never heard this. I'm sorry that I'm the bearer of the bad news, but truth be told, it's a story that needs to be told, and it needs apologies need to happen, and the Israeli government, instead of putting together half-baked commissions, should really do the right thing. It's Rabbi Sachs signing off. If you have questions, you can either at Facebook or my email address, rabbi@thechaicenter.com. And if you would like to see other classes, it's thechaicenter.com/academy. God bless.